One voice. That's how it all began. A single voice that pierced the silence of history. It wasn't loud. It didn't thunder. It simply called a man named Abram. Leave your land, your father's house, everything you've ever known, and walk into a promise you can't yet see. It sounds simple until you realize what it meant. To leave not just geography, but identity. To let go of what was safe in order to receive what was sacred. That voice didn't just call a man. It began a movement, not a religion, not yet a nation, but a covenant, unfolding like a thread across generations. That man, Abram, would one day be renamed Abraham, but not because he changed his name, because his name was changed for him by the one who called him. He wasn't chosen for his greatness. He was chosen because he responded, and in his response, history bent. Nations were born, prophecies awakened, a people emerged. But what if that moment, what we call the beginning of Jewish history, was never just about them? What if it was about all who would one day hear that same call and wonder, was that meant for me too? Because 3,750 years isn't just a number. It's a timeline of a living covenant, a thread that never snapped, even when it frayed. It ran through slavery and freedom, through temples razed and ruined, through exile and return. It survived Rome. It survived Babylon. It survived betrayal and forgetting, because it wasn't rooted in power. It was rooted in promise. And a promise kept by God never expires, only waits to be fulfilled in the next generation willing to say yes. So what if this isn't just a story about the past? What if Abraham isn't just someone you read about, but someone you resemble? What if you too have heard whispers in the silence, felt a restlessness that home couldn't satisfy, a longing no tradition could explain? Then maybe, just maybe, you haven't been watching history from the outside. Maybe you've been standing in the same place Abraham once stood, asked not to prove yourself, but to walk forward in faith. Maybe that same voice is calling again, not through thunder, not through fire, but through the quiet ache in your soul that refuses to be ignored. He was called the father of many nations, not one, not two, many. And yet, from the moment his two sons were born, the seed of division was planted. Isaac and Ishmael. Two boys who shared the same father, but not the same inheritance. Two promises spoken, but only one recognized. Or so it seemed. From Isaac came Jacob. From Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. From Ishmael, 12 princes, nations in their own right. And yet across history, one line would be remembered, canonized, celebrated. The other, sidelined, forgotten, or worse, feared. But what if we've misunderstood the nature of the covenant? What if the tension between Isaac and Ishmael was never meant to produce enemies, but to reveal how easily we reduce divine inheritance to exclusivity? Jubilees doesn't erase the distinction between the sons. It names them, locates them, honors them. It says each was given a portion, a role, a boundary, and none were left out of the divine plan. It is not favoritism that defines the covenant. It is faithfulness, not of men, but of God. And yet, the wound remains. The conflict between brothers has become the conflict between peoples, between religions, between bloodlines. And so the question echoes: did the division begin in heaven or only in our hearts? Did God abandon Ishmael, or did we? When we read the story of Abraham's household, we often forget how much it mirrors our own world. Families fractured, inheritance questioned, promises misunderstood. We don't just inherit land, we inherit pain, assumptions, silence, bitterness passed down like a birthright. But what if we are not only inheritors of wounds, but of healing too? To see Isaac and Ishmael not just as ancestors of nations, but as shadows within us all. This is where the reframe begins. Because in a world where the descendants of both still war, still argue, still bleed for what was promised, the covenant continues to ask, will you inherit the land or the heart behind it? This isn't about choosing sides. It's about recognizing that the promise was never meant to be possessed. It was meant to be stewarded. That the pain we see between peoples may be the result of misreading a God who never cancelled one son to validate another. If that's true, then what we call history might just be the record of a family still trying to come home. And what we call division may be the ache of a body remembering it was once whole. They were never just escaping a place. They were being reshaped into a people. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, it wasn't merely a migration, it was a transformation. 400 years of slavery had not only broken their backs, but blurred their identity. They had forgotten who they were, forgotten the promises made to their fathers, forgotten what it meant to belong to a covenant. So when God brought them out, He didn't lead them straight to a throne or a city. He led them to a mountain. At Sinai, freedom met instruction. The 10 Commandments weren't laws to restrict them. They were the language of a relationship, a holy structure through which they would remember who they truly were, not survivors of Egypt, but sons and daughters of the Most High. The Ark of the Covenant, carried on their shoulders, wasn't just a symbol. It was a mobile reminder of presence, God with them, among them, guiding them not just toward a destination, but toward a new identity. But even with commandments written in stone, forgetfulness was never far away. The people wavered, they worshipped idols, they demanded kings, they traded intimacy for institution. Yet, even in their rebellion, God didn't abandon the covenant. He reshaped it, reiterated it, recalled them through judges, prophets, and eventually kings, not to build empires, but to rebuild hearts. David rose, not as the tallest, not as the most strategic, but as the one after God's own heart. Under his reign, Israel didn't just gain territory, it gained a song. A psalmic vision of a people rooted in worship, not warfare. And when his son Solomon built the temple, it wasn't just an architectural feat, it was an echo of Eden, a sacred space where heaven brushed earth, and where the ark, the very heart of the covenant, would rest. Still, even at their peak, something subtle but tragic began to take root. The belief that blessing came from strength, not surrender. That being chosen meant being superior, not being accountable. The temple stood tall, but the hearts of the people drifted low. Prosperity without remembrance breeds pride, and pride, left unchecked, forgets the covenant that formed it. The story of Israel's rise wasn't about geopolitical triumph. It was about spiritual formation, a journey from slaves to sons, from fear to reverence, from wandering to worship. And yet, as we'll soon see, even the strongest kingdom can fracture when its people forget the very promise that gave them breath. Because the covenant was never about land alone, it was about the Lord who walked with them, even through the desert. And every time they forgot that, the land itself became dust in their hands. It began with a fracture, not of land, but of heart. After Solomon's death, the kingdom that once stood united under the covenant split in two. 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south. What had been one house of Israel now became divided. Israel and Judah, brothers turned neighbors, neighbors turned strangers. The northern tribes, isolated by politics and pride, drifted further from the covenant's center. Prophets were sent, warnings were spoken, but the hearts of the people had already turned. And so, in 722 BC, the northern kingdom fell. Assyria swept in, cities burned, families scattered, and the 10 tribes disappeared. They weren't erased in a single day. They faded, piece by piece, language lost, customs diluted, names forgotten. And with each generation, the memory of their origin dimmed, like smoke rising from the ruins of Samaria. They became a question with no clear answer. A rumor in the scrolls, a mystery tucked between verses. The lost tribes of Israel, not only absent from geography, but from the collective conscience of the people they once stood beside. Judah remained for a time, but Babylon would come for them too. The temple, once the resting place of the ark, was torn down. The priests were silenced. The songs of Zion became laments by foreign rivers. But exile wasn't just a political crisis. It was a spiritual collapse. Not the end of God's faithfulness, but the consequence of forgetting it. And yet, even in the silence of Babylon, something stirred. A longing, a remembering, not just of land, but of purpose. Because a covenant written on tablets can be shattered, but a covenant written on hearts can be reawakened. The question isn't whether the 10 tribes are lost. The deeper question is, are they still forgotten? The book of Jubilees hints that they were never meant to vanish entirely, that their scattering was not abandonment, but delay. A pause in their role, not the end of it. And what if the ache we feel, this yearning for restoration, for identity, for something ancient and unfulfilled, isn't random? What if it's the voice of memory, echoing through the lineage of the soul? Maybe the lost tribes are more than a historical puzzle. Maybe they are the symbol of every person, every people, who once knew they belonged to something holy and lost the map home. And maybe, just maybe, you're not watching this because you're curious. Maybe you're watching because something inside you has begun to remember. Because the covenant was never discarded. It was only hidden, waiting to be found again. And if 10 tribes could be scattered by history, they can also be gathered by mercy. If they can be remembered by God, then perhaps they are already being awakened in those who hear His voice again. Not through politics, not through proof, but through a quiet pull on the heart, whispering, "Come home, you were never forgotten." They returned. After 70 years of exile, weary but not broken, the people of Judah came home. They carried no armies, no wealth, no guarantees. only scrolls, memory, and the longing to rebuild. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, they laid the stones of a new Jerusalem, not as grand as before, not as glorious, but sacred nonetheless. The second temple rose where Solomon's once stood, and the people rejoiced. It looked like restoration. It sounded like fulfillment. But was it? The Ark of the Covenant was missing. The divine fire that once filled the Holy of Holies did not descend again. The cloud didn't return. The voices of the prophets grew silent, and though the temple stood, something within its walls remained hollow. The sacrifices resumed, but the intimacy had thinned. The rituals returned, but the presence had not. Israel had come back to the land, but had the covenant come back to the people? Over the next few centuries, foreign empires came and went: Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Judea remained, but never truly free. The people clung to their identity, their memory, their scriptures. But deep within, the ache persisted. They were back, but not home. They were present, but not whole. They had the temple, but not the glory that once made it tremble. Then came the revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, fierce, passionate, devastating. For a brief moment, hope surged that Israel might rise again, but the rebellion was crushed. Over 500,000 Jews perished. The Romans dismantled the last remnants of the dream. Jerusalem was renamed. Judea was wiped from maps. The people were scattered once more, not just by swords, but by silence. A name erased, a place forbidden, a people displaced again. But the deeper tragedy wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They had returned to the land, but forgotten why it mattered. The covenant wasn't a contract with soil. It was a relationship, a vow of belonging, of obedience, of worship. Without that, even holy ground becomes hollow. And when that center is lost, every wall, every city, every monument becomes a shell. This is where we must pause, not in judgment, but in reflection. How often do we rebuild the outer form while neglecting the inner flame? How many times do we equate return with restoration, success with sanctification? The people rebuilt a nation, but the covenant still waited. Waited not for monuments, but for hearts. Not for kings, but for faithfulness. The question was never just, can we go home? It was always, will we bring him with us when we do? So the temple stood, the city stirred, but the silence in the Holy of Holies was a whisper to the generations. The covenant isn't completed by stone or sword. It is completed when the heart returns, not just the feet. And until that happens, every homecoming is only halfway. Every rebuilding is only partial. And every nation, no matter how ancient or glorious, remains unfinished until it remembers what made it holy in the first place. In 1948, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, a nation was reborn. The declaration of the State of Israel sent shockwaves through the world. Survivors of the Holocaust watched as a new flag rose over ancient soil. Prayers whispered in exile for centuries seemed, at last, to be answered. A language once confined to liturgy was spoken again in streets and schools. Cities emerged, farmland bloomed. The impossible had happened. Israel lived again, but almost immediately, war followed. then another, and another. The land did not respond with peace. Blood stained the soil almost as soon as it was reclaimed. The dream of return, so deeply rooted in exile, collided with the complexities of reality. Borders were drawn, then redrawn. Enemies rose from without, and unrest stirred from within. And yet, many still look to that moment, 1948, as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. A finished chapter, a covenant completed. But what if we've confused survival with fulfillment? What if the return to the land was never meant to be the end of the story, but a mirror reflecting what was still missing? The prophet spoke of a return, yes, but also of a return in spirit. A people cleansed, not just gathered. A heart restored, not just a border secured. Ezekiel didn't just see dry bones rising into armies. He saw breath entering them. Spirit, life, renewal. Has that breath truly entered yet? Because a nation may stand, and still the covenant may wait. A people may be home, and still the presence may be absent. In 1948, a remarkable event took place. Historic, brave, sacred in its own way. But was it the end of the exile, or only the beginning of a new chapter, one still unfolding, one still awaiting something deeper than political sovereignty? There's a silence when you walk the Western Wall, not because God isn't near, but because not everything is finished. The Ark is still missing. The temple is still in ruins. The 10 tribes are still scattered. And the covenant, if we are honest, is still longing for a people who remember why they were called in the first place. Not to be powerful, not to be envied, but to be holy, to be light, to be faithful. And here lies the tension. Can a flag alone fulfill a covenant? Can independence replace intimacy? Can prophecy be measured in headlines and borders? Or must we look deeper into the fractured unity, the forgotten tribes, the inward drift, the absent ark, and ask, is the covenant fulfilled, or have we settled for a symbol of it? This isn't an indictment, it's an invitation to reconsider what we mean when we say fulfillment. To let awe give way to discernment, to not mistake restoration for completion. Because perhaps what began in 1948 was not the end of the story, but the reminder that something holy is still unfinished. And if so, then the most important chapter is not behind us, but ahead. And it may begin not with a declaration of statehood, but with a cry of return, not to land, but to covenant, not just to Jerusalem, but to the presence of the one who once walked among the tribes and still waits to walk again. The story didn't end in Babylon. It didn't end in Rome. It didn't end in 1948. It hasn't ended because it was never just a story about one tribe, one flag, or one piece of land. The covenant that began with Abraham didn't come with a border. It came with a calling. And that calling was never just ethnic. It was always spiritual. It was never just about being born into a people, but being awakened into a purpose. For 3,750 years, that covenant has flowed through generations like a hidden current, sometimes roaring, sometimes silent, but never still. It's moved through tents and temples, through exile and empire, through hope and heartbreak. And yet, here it is, still alive, not because of political resilience, but because of divine mercy. Not because of human perfection, but because of God's promise. And that promise was never about one nation alone. It was about restoring a people who would carry his name with reverence across every tongue, tribe, and time. So now the question turns, not toward history, but toward you. If the covenant is still alive, then where are its people? If the tribes are still scattered, then where are they being gathered? And if the fulfillment is still waiting, then who will step into it? The answer is not found in ancestry records or geopolitical debates. It's found in hearts that still tremble at the sound of his voice, in souls that still long for the days when God walked with his people, not in ceremony, but in covenant. If you've ever felt like you didn't quite belong in the systems around you, if you've sensed there's a deeper name written somewhere within your spirit, then maybe you're not just watching history. Maybe you're remembering something holy you were born to carry. The covenant was never just about being chosen. It was about choosing back, choosing to remember, choosing to return, choosing to walk in the footsteps of Abraham, not by blood, but by faith, not to claim an inheritance of power, but to embody a calling of faithfulness. And in a world still divided by names and nations, perhaps the ones who awaken to this calling will be the ones through whom the covenant breathes again. So, as this journey closes, another begins. Because the covenant never ended, it waits. It waits not for political resolution, but for spiritual return. It waits not for the perfect, but for the willing. And if you hear it, if something inside you has stirred, then know this: the story isn't complete without you. The covenant is not fulfilled until it is carried. And maybe, just maybe, you were always meant to be one who carries it.